It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. The first federal charges have been announced in the special counsel probe of the Trump campaign and alleged Russian meddling. Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort and former business partner Rick Gates are accused of financial crimes. But the allegations appear to have no direct connection to the 2016 campaign. They've pleaded not guilty. The more interesting case might be that of Trump campaign foreign policy advisor George Papadopoulos. He has reached a plea deal admitting to making false statements to investigators about his contacts with a foreign national said to have ties to Russia. At the White House today, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders downplayed Papadopoulos' role in the campaign.
We've been saying from day one there's been no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, and nothing in the indictment today changes that at all.
But the George Papadopoulos agreement is about the campaign. It is specifically about the campaign.
It has nothing to do with the activities of the campaign. It has to do with his failure to tell the truth. That doesn't have anything to do with the campaign or the campaign's activities.
But it is the clearest evidence yet of ties between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. So.
Again, there are no activities or official capacity in which the Trump campaign was engaged in any of these activities. Most of them took place well before the campaign ever even existed.
I'm joined now by two guests. Marcy Wheeler is an independent journalist whose blog is Empty Wheel, where she's been writing on the indictments as well as at The Intercept today. And James Henry is an economist and attorney with the Tax Justice Network. Welcome to you both. Marcy, I'll start with you. I take it that, like usual, we're not going to agree on very much, but I think we might agree that of these two indictments today, the one against this foreign policy aide, George Papadopoulos, might be more significant, at least when it comes to this whole issue of alleged or perhaps Trump-Russia collusion. Your thoughts on what his case means?
I think you need to understand the two together. What happened is on October 5th, Mueller flipped this guy, flipped George P., and actually got him to start cooperating, as far as we can tell, in July. So for over 2 months, George P. has been talking to the government, to the FBI, and to Mueller's people. Very importantly, there is a footnote in the complaint against George P. that references Manafort. So there's this discussion about, hey, let's set up a meeting between Trump and Vladimir Putin, and unnamed people in that footnote say, let's play this down, let's have low-level people deal with it. That's Manafort and the other guy who got indicted with him today. So what we know is they're pushing Manafort to flip. He refused to flip. So they charged him with kind of the lower level charges, which is garden variety money laundering, although fairly spectacular garden variety money laundering. And then at the same time, they unsealed this complaint about George P., showing that George P. has for the last 2 months been shouting up a storm with the FBI about what really went on and what really was going on between a willingness to work with Russia. And so that's how to understand them. Is the George P. stuff is very fascinating, very inflammatory. Mueller is hiding the most interesting bits of it, though. He has shown enough such that Manafort might be far more interested in pushing after reading it. But there are bits in there that he just nods to, which are going to be really interesting when we see some further.
Well, how do you know he's hiding the interesting bits? Because he does say that George P. says that an unnamed professor, who the indictment says has connections to the Russian government, told him that the Russian government has thousands of emails on Hillary Clinton, which, you know, certainly seems pretty explosive. So what indicates to you that Mueller is hiding something?
Because when George P. first and second talked to the FBI, so the claim against George P. is that he had 2 interviews with the FBI, one in January, one in February, and lied in both of them about certain things. And then the day after the second one, started deleting his Facebook account, actually deleted the entire Facebook account, to hide communications he was having with the Russians. So they charged him with lying about what he told them about what had really gone on with the Russians. And basically what he told them in January was, yeah, I met this woman. She said she was the niece of Vladimir Putin, but that was all before I joined the campaign. And oh, by the way, I didn't tell anybody on the campaign about those emails because I wasn't sure whether they were true or not. We don't know what the truth is. We know that they believe his claim that he didn't tell the campaign about the emails is not true. So in other words, as you said, it is fairly explosive that we now know he learned that the Russians were sitting on thousands of Hillary emails on April 26th, which is actually 3 days before the DNC found out they had been pawned by the Russians. So he learned really early that there were emails sitting out there. And he learned, importantly, before the June 9th meeting that Paul Manafort attended, looking for dirt from Hillary Clinton. Same word. Both meetings, both allegations were about dirt. What we don't know is what George P. has for the last 2 months been explaining about what he told the campaign about those emails.
Okay, here's where I push back a little bit, because I think it's an explosive claim that he says that some professor who has ties to Russia told him that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton emails. But I don't think it's conclusive. I mean, again, it's sort of like hearsay about hearsay. He says a professor told him that the Russians had these emails. And who is he again? He's a low-level campaign staffer who, when he tried to actually set up a meeting between the Trump campaign and Russia, the Trump campaign said, no, we don't want to meet these people.
That's not true. As late as July, Manafort was going to be in that meeting with George P. August 15th, that meeting was still going to be set up with George P. and somebody else. Then what happened was Manafort's corruption became clear and Manafort became toxic. So it is the complaint makes it clear that the meeting never happened, but the complaint never says that they refused the meeting. And lots of details in the affidavit signed for his arrest in July make it quite clear that they were very happy to continue discussions about the meeting. But the other reason why it's not just his claim that the emails existed, and boy is George P. dumb, because he was talking to what are effectively Russian handlers on Skype. And right, so Skype and Facebook, they're both prison providers. They're both, like, as soon as the government finds a foreigner that they want to target, which I'm sure they did, then they're going to get all of the foreigners' discussions, which would have gone between the foreigner and George P., so this professor in London, and also the fake niece in Russia. And also there was another third person involved with Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. So 3 different foreigners they could target. All of those communications the FBI had when George P. was lying to them about what he said. So it's not just George P.'s claim that he heard about the emails. It's that the FBI has SIGINT showing that he was lying about the emails.
But the Washington Post reported a few months ago, in terms of this meeting between setting up a meeting between the Trump campaign and Russia, the Washington Post reported back in August that this was shot down pretty quickly, that several Trump aides raised concerns and it didn't get very far. So what's missing here?
Aaron, you know as well as I do that often these leaks, particularly for these kind of secretive investigations, are meant to preemptively undercut charges. And that is a brilliant example of it, because they also quote from that footnote that I told you about, where Manafort was saying, okay, well, we'll have a low-level person deal with it. But the Washington Post story, and presumably that's what they got fed, the Washington Post story cuts it off early. So it doesn't explain that a low-level person was going to continue to deal with it. And again, between the complaint and the affidavit, it's very clear that they were continuing to set up those meetings and were quite interested in setting up those meetings. So that Washington Post story is, in retrospect, this utterly wonderful example of how, because Manafort or whoever else was dealing stuff to the Washington Post, how they can control the narrative if they have information to, that seems to feed the story, but only kind of gets their side out ahead of time. The FBI hasn't been sharing what it's sitting on, and it still isn't. As I said, there are still these really ripe silences in all of these documents that we can point to where Manafort knows what went on, Jeff Sessions knows what went on, Carter Page knows what went on, but we don't. And those silences are precisely to build pressure on people such that they'll flip and we can build a bigger campaign, a bigger case against all these people. So yeah, we still know just a very little bit about this, but what we know is that Washington Post was a limited hangout, and now we know a little more of the story, and the story makes it clear that the campaign was interested in setting up a meeting with the Russians.
Okay, we'll come back to this tangent. James Henry, you specialize in the kinds of crimes that Paul Manafort and his former business partner were charged with today. Your thoughts on the indictments?
Well, I was entertained by this indictment. I think we have some pretty interesting expenditures by Paul Manafort if the evidence holds up in court. Something like $75 million that were tracked through 13 Cyprus accounts, a bunch of other offshore companies, and they ended up not being reported, according to the indictment, for tax purposes. So Manafort is spending millions on landscaping at 174 his house in Watermill, which is quite stunning. It's an $8 million property, by the way, subject to confiscation under this asset program, asset recovery program that Mueller is going to invoke. You know, I thought that this indicated a link to the very good reporting the New York Times did back in July on where all this money in Cyprus came from. It came mainly from an oligarch named Deripaska, who is one of the biggest owners of the aluminum industry in Russia and is reputedly close to Vladimir Putin, although what that means remains to be determined. But he was certainly passing Manafort a lot of money to these companies that ended up, according to the indictment, then relaying it to fund Paul's lifestyle. The other implicated fellow here is Rick Gates. So here we have two Republican presidential campaign managers kind of in a row, except for whoever advised Romney. But this was, Rick Gates was John McCain's campaign manager back in 2008. And then Manafort appears here. So both of these people are, you know, pretty active practitioners of the offshore haven and onshore haven financial secrecy sort of behavior. It's, you know, not surprising the Republicans have been opposed to any kind of crackdown on that kind of secrecy. But, you know, I think it's misleading to characterize this as completely irrelevant or well before the 2016 campaign by Trump. First of all, a lot of the infractions are charged here occurred in late 2016, 2017. Secondly, the tax fraud involved here is a continuing offense. You know, and all of these non-disclosures that are charged in these in the indictment on the part of Gates and Manafort are continuing offenses. But secondly, it should be disturbing to Republicans. I would think that, you know, they can't seem to find a campaign manager who doesn't, you know, actively exploit the offshore haven industry. So there's a lot of explaining here to be done at the very least on the part of Manafort's lawyers. What I would say about the overall story here is that this is, you know, as Churchill said, this is not the end or even the beginning of the end, but it is, you know, an indication that we are, you know, going to have to, you know, all of us who are specialists in this investigation have to discount a little bit about our natural interest in all these details, because I'm concerned at the end of the day that the American people have to get on board and figure out that all of this stuff in these indictments constitutes something that they want the president removed for. And an impeachable offense requires a new Congress probably, and a whole lot more Democratic senators probably, and that's not going to happen for a while. So Mueller's strategy is just beginning, and this is going to roll out over a long period of time, so it's kind of premature to characterize this as the fatal blow that will be struck against Trump, but I think it's a good start.
So if I'm wrong to characterize the Manafort and Gates indictment as not directly connected to the 2016 campaign. What is the direct connection then? Because their alleged crimes here pertain to Ukraine, not Russia.
Well, we don't know exactly what the significance of all this will be. It's clearly designed to put a lot of pressure on Manafort to spill what he really knows about the 2016 campaign. So the direct relevance of, the Ukrainian specific kind of money laundering that went on here is not the point. The point is that this is part of a grand strategy to turn some people to become witnesses against the president. And yeah, I think Mueller is, is demonstrating, some efficiency in terms of getting, compared with other special counsels who've taken years to get to this kind of indictment stage. I mean, he's moving at lightning speed. And so, technically speaking, the Ukrainian elections and the, Yanukovych, well, I mean, it brought down Tony Podesta today, had to resign from his firm because he was one of the unnamed lobbyists.
Well, let's explain that. Let's explain that, James. So Tony Podesta ran a very powerful lobbying group. He's the brother, of course, of John Podesta, the chair of Clinton's campaign. And because of the Mueller probe, he is now stepping down from his firm. What does that indicate to you? Do you think that it was reported last week, I believe, that Podesta is also in Mueller's sights?
We don't know about whether that's true, but Tony Podesta has been a very powerful and I have to say somewhat non-discriminating lobbyist when it comes to representing these kinds of clients. I mean, I was involved in investigating Credit Suisse's plea bargain with the Justice Department in 2014. Tony Podesta was lobbying heavily all over the Justice Department to get them a sweetheart deal, which they ultimately got. This is at the same time that his brother was a special counsel to the president. So in this case, he was sensitive to the fact that his company A was the unnamed lobbyist that was a kind of a front for Paul Manafort's lobbying efforts to represent the Ukrainian pro-Russian president in Washington. And, he had to step down because Fox News was, as he said, Fox News has made it impossible for me to be a PR advocate effectively.
Poor guy. Marcy Wheeler, Marcy Wheeler, I want to talk more about Papadopoulos. I have a question. Okay, so if he was the intermediary for in between the Trump campaign and Russia, why is he not facing even worse charges than just lying to the FBI? I mean, if he was the guy who helped the alleged collusion, if that's what he did, as many suspect he did now, why not charge him with conspiring with a foreign power?
Because he's the first guy who did it. I mean, honestly, that's the way it works. If you are exposed in such a way, and I would say he is alleged to be one of maybe 5 go-betweens, right?
Yeah.
Manafort is clearly another one. Flynn is clearly another one. Carter Page is another one. Jared Kushner, another one. So George P., first guy to flip, he's going to get the best deal. And what Mueller did with these charges against Manafort were, one, take away all his money because it all got forfeited. So he lost 18 million or something today, forfeited because of badly gained goods, which means he can't pay for lawyers. He has a $10 million bail bond. He lost all his antique drugs. And that puts him in a much more sensitive position where, A, he's not going to be able to resist being charged for those other charges. But B, he knows that the government already knows what George P. was going to say. So you want to get in, you want to flip it as quickly as possible. George P. flipped in July. This today is best understood as Mueller's polite way of explaining to Manafort that it's in his best interest to flip as well. And so you will see, like the next, if Manafort doesn't flip, right, if this is not enough to convince him to flip against Trump, and a lot of that is going to be dictated by whether Trump pardons him. If Manafort doesn't flip, then I would expect to see a indictment in, say, a month and a half. that talked more about his ties to Deripaska, that talked more about how he was reporting back to Deripaska, that talked about his debt to Deripaska, that talks about his willingness. This is again the silent stuff, George P's complaint. His willingness to set up meetings with the Russians, to talk about his role in the 9th meeting. Those are all there. Those are all what I think Mueller knows to charge Manafort with tomorrow. He's trying to get Manafort to flip, and frankly, to flip before his reputation has been made impossible to go on the witness stand. Although this is kind of easy, such that he can flip against people like Don and Kushner, and that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to, convince people that garden variety money laundering is much less problematic to be convicted of than basically trading.
Well, my obvious response is that if the attempt is to get Manafort to flip, that assumes that Manafort has something to flip on. And for that to have happened, that means that there were people above Papadopoulos who then took his overtures to Russia and then went further with that, and somehow through all of this set up their own channel to Russia in an attempt to collude with them, right? So for this theory to work, there has to be more people above him who had even higher level contacts and more extensive contacts than he did, or at least that we know about with Russia.
Right, and we know that Manafort did. The big question on Manafort is...
How do we know that? No, we don't know that.
No, we do, because we know that he was basically working for free for Trump as a favor for this Russian oligarch, Deripaska, whom he owed millions to. And he was...
Wait, you think that the reason Manafort was working for Trump was because he owed a favor to a Russian oligarch? That's why Manafort was working for Trump?
That's why he was working for free for Trump. That's why he was willing to work for free for Trump. He had debt that he needed to get out of, and one way to get out of it was selling out the campaign to this Russian oligarch. That's all out there, right? So, but the point is, where I was going with that is Manafort only through August 19th as a campaign. And as I said, on August 19th, we know that there was a plan to have George P. with one other person who may well have been Manafort go to London and have this meeting, but that became toxic and Manafort got ousted. George P. did not. We don't know what happened with George P. after August 19th. We know he stayed on the campaign. But we also don't know what happened in the aftermath of that June 9th meeting. You know that at least Manafort probably had a sense going into that meeting that the dirt in question was not, as alleged, these claims about donations to other Democrats, but instead actual emails that started coming out later. So that's where we're going, and you have to remember that Manafort is sleazy as hell, but you need to get beyond August 9th into the Kushner meetings after the election.
James Henry, your thoughts on this point that there is more to look at when it comes to the meetings after the election?
Well, I think, there's we're at the beginning of the ring cycle here in Wagnerian terms. This is very early days. I think Mueller is playing this game. Basically, he has to have up his sleeve some idea that Paul Manafort has a lot to talk about. Even after the nomination, even after his being fired. He and Gates, his partner, maintained a relationship with the Trump administration, with the Trump campaign right through the end of December of 2016, and they were, I think they were probably communicating during that period. The real issue comes down to what did Manafort really do for the Russians, and what did all the people that they were colluding with, if that was what was going on, actually delivering? Simply sitting in a meeting and listening to, kind of gossip about Hillary doesn't rise to the level that's going to, cross the finish line when we get to impeachment proceedings. We have to have something on the part of Manafort or the other, his other co-conspirators, in terms of real deliverables that were, offered to the Russians and accepted. And I don't think we're there yet.
Marcy, if you could speculate, and by the way, again, I've seen no evidence that any of this quid pro quo occurred. It was alleged in the Steele dossier, which we now know was funded by Democrats. But your thoughts on, if they existed, if it happened, what those deliverables would have been?
Well, the deliverables would have been what Mike Flynn is known to have talked about with Sergei Kislyak on December 29th, which is getting rid of sanctions.
Which didn't happen.
It didn't happen because he was fired, right?
Right, but
you can't. May I say this?
Please, James. Yes.
Yeah, I would say that the fact. Excuse me. The fact that it has been difficult for Putin and company to collect on their loans or collect on their advances here, is kind of in part a function of the fact that all this has come out.
Assuming they made a loan to begin with. But sorry, James.
Well, I'm certainly, but it's not surprising to me that it was difficult for Trump to, roll back on the NATO demands, to roll back on sanctions. As I've heard it from the FSB people, they're saying, well, we overachieved here. I mean, we have buyer's regret. We can get nothing through Washington that's pro-Russian right now. So, but that's not surprising, and it's not inconsistent with their having set out to do this. It's just that they screwed up.
Okay. Well, we have to wrap, so Marcy, I'll give you the final comment. I just want to say that this claim from George P. in his indictment is the most tangible thing I've seen so far, and it's, to me, a secondhand claim about a secondhand claim, which is it's him saying that a professor who we're told has ties to Russia had it's told him that the Russian government had Hillary's emails. But it is something, it's in a document, it's there. Marcy Wheeler, your final comments, where you think things are going from here, very quickly.
I think we are going to see whether Manafort flips or whether he gets pardoned. That's the big drama, and it may decide whether this moves forward at all.
Exactly. And look forward to checking back in with both of you to continue covering this topic. Marcy Wheeler, independent journalist whose blog is Empty Wheel. She's also written a piece today on The Intercept about Jeff Sessions, which we didn't get to talk about. Marcy, very quickly, do you want to give us a brief summary of that, why you think Jeff Sessions might be in trouble because of the indictments today? Sure.
So they kept George P.'s documents sealed largely for Manafort, but also for Sessions. He testified on the 18th. He was asked again about all his claims that he knew nothing about collusion and nothing about surrogates actually meeting with Russians. We know that in a meeting on March 31st, at which both Trump and Sessions attended, George P. sat down and said, well, I'm in negotiations about setting up a meeting with Putin because of X, Y, and Z. So that says Sessions lied, again, under oath, to the Senate. And he keeps having to kind of retreat on his sworn claims to the Senate, and I think this will cause him more grief with his overseas, because he basically perjured again and again and again.
And I'll just stress one more time that the meeting didn't happen. James Henry, I'll give you a final comment if you want one.
I love Marcy's piece on Jeff Sessions, but they ought to also look at his involvement in the Tennessee Valley nuke project that Flynn was trying to wheel to Turkey. So, there's a number of Sessions-related questions that we could really stand a lot more exploration of.
Look forward to talking more about it. Marcy Wheeler, James Henry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.